3 years on, Ukraine's extinction nightmare has returned. Kyiv no longer looks like a city at war in the way that it was 3 years ago. The shops are open and commuters get delayed in traffic jams on their way to work. But in the days since the 12th of February this year, when US President Donald Trump rang Russia's Vladimir Putin to send a 90-minute political embrace from the White House to the Kremlin, 2022's old nightmares of national extinction have returned. Ukrainians used to get angry about the way that President Joe Biden held back weapons systems and restricted the way Ukraine used the ones that arrived here. Even so, they knew whose side he was on. Instead, Donald Trump has delivered a stream of exaggeration, half-truths, and outright lies about the war that echo the views of President Putin. They include his dismissal of Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky as a dictator who does not deserve a seat at the table when America and Russia decide the future of his country. The biggest lie Trump has told is that Ukraine started the war. Trump's negotiating strategy is to offer concessions even before serious talks have started. Instead of putting pressure on the country that broke international law by invading its neighbor, leading to huge destruction and hundreds of thousands of dead and wounded, he has turned on Ukraine. His public statements have offered Russia important concessions, declaring that Ukraine will not join NATO, and accepting that it will keep at least some of the land it seized by force. Vladimir Putin's record shows he respects strength. He regards concessions as a sign of weakness. He has not budged from a demand for even more Ukrainian land than his men now occupy. Immediately after the first talks held in Saudi Arabia between Russia and the US since the 2022 invasion, Putin's foreign minister Sergei Lavrov repeated his demand that no NATO troops would be allowed into Ukraine to provide security guarantees. A veteran European diplomat who has dealt with the Russians and the Americans told me that when the grizzled, highly experienced Lavrov met Trump's novice Secretary of State Marco Rubio, he would have eaten him like a soft-boiled egg. Challenging times. A few days ago, as Trump threw more insults at Ukraine's president, I went to the heavily guarded government quarter in Kyiv to meet Ihor Brusilo, who is a senior advisor to Volodymyr Zelensky and deputy head of his office. Brusilo acknowledged how much pressure Trump is putting on them. "It's very, very tough. These are very hard, challenging times," Brusilo said. "I wouldn't say that now it's easier than it was in 2022. It's like you live it all over again." Brusilo said Ukrainians and their president were as determined to fight to stay independent as they had been in 2022. "We're a sovereign country, we are part of Europe, and we will remain so." Fading colors. In the weeks after Vladimir Putin ordered the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the sound of battle on the edge of Kyiv echoed around streets that were almost empty. Checkpoints and barricades, walls of sandbags and tank traps welded from steel girders were rushed out onto Kyiv's broad boulevards. At the railway station, 50,000 civilians a day, mostly women and children, were boarding trains going west, away from the Russians. The platforms were packed, and every time a train pulled in, came another surge of panic as people pushed and shoved to get on. In those freezing days, in bitter wind and flurries of snow, it felt as if the colors of the 21st century were fading into an old monochrome newsreel that Europeans had believed until then was safely consigned to the vaults of history. President Zelensky, in Joe Biden's words, didn't want to hear American warnings that an invasion was imminent. Putin rattling a Russian saber was one thing. A full-scale invasion with tens of thousands of troops and columns of armor surely belonged in the past. Putin believed Russia's mighty and modernized army would make quick work of its obstinate, independent neighbor and its recalcitrant president. Ukraine's Western allies also thought Russia would win quickly. On television news channels, retired generals talked about smuggling in light weapons to arm an insurgency while the West imposed sanctions and hoped for the best. As Russian troops massed on Ukraine's borders, Germany delivered 5,000 ballistic combat helmets instead of offensive weapons. Vitaly Klitschko, the mayor of Kyiv and once heavyweight boxing champion of the world, complained to a German newspaper that it was a joke. "What kind of support will Germany send next, pillows?" Zelensky turned down any idea of leaving his capital to form a government in exile. He abandoned his presidential dark suit for military attire and in videos and on social media, told Ukrainians he would fight alongside them. Ukraine defeated the Russian thrust towards the capital. Once the Ukrainians had demonstrated that they could fight well, the attitude of the Americans and Europeans changed. Arms supplies increased. Putin's mistake was that he prepared for a parade, not a war, a senior Ukrainian official recalled, speaking on condition of anonymity. He didn't think Ukraine would fight. He thought they would be welcomed with speeches and flowers. On the 29th of March 2022, the Russians retreated from Kyiv. Hours after they left, we drove nervously into the chaotic, damaged landscape of Kyiv's satellite towns, Irpin, Bucha, and Hostomel. On the roads the Russians had hoped to use for a triumphant entry into Kyiv, I saw bodies of civilians left where they were killed. Charred tires were stacked around some of them, failed attempts to burn the evidence of war crimes. Survivors spoke of the brutality of the Russian occupiers. A woman showed me the grave where she had buried her son single-handed after he was casually shot dead as he crossed a road. Russian soldiers threw her out of her house. In the garden they left piles of empty bottles of vodka, whiskey, and gin that they had looted and drunk. Hastily abandoned Russian encampments in the forest near the roads were choked with rubbish their soldiers had discarded over the weeks of occupation. Professional, disciplined armies do not eat and sleep next to rotting piles of their own refuse. 3 years on, the war has changed. Although Kyiv has revived, it still has nightly alerts as its air defenses detect incoming Russian missiles and drones. The war is closer and more deadly along the front line, more than 1,000 kilometers long, that runs from the northern border with Russia, and then east and south down to the Black Sea. It is lined with destroyed, almost deserted villages and towns. To the east, in what was Kyiv's industrial heartland of Donetsk and Luhansk, Russian forces grind forward slowly, at a huge cost in men and machines. Thank you for watching Topics on Trend. Go ahead and check out another trending video on our channel here, like subscribe, comment, and share.